So, hello, Glenn. How are you doing?
Hey, John. I'm fine, man. It's been a really long time since we did a blogging head.
A little bit too long, indeed. That's right. But here we are.
I think so. You know, there's been demand for your services. They don't care about me. I'm old and uninteresting.
They do care about you.
But, but there are people out there who say, "Where's McWhorter?"
Yeah, what they really mean is, where is McWhorter and Loury? But, yeah, as we know, there are also quite a few people who I imagine have not been calling for me to be back because of my embarrassment from, I believe it was a couple of months ago. You heard about that, right?
I heard about it after the fact. I saw that there was very much lively commentary. I went and I looked at the thing, and I thought, just a bunch of political correctness is what I thought. I mean, I thought you were exploring something that you thought was intellectually interesting without necessarily giving it full credence, but thinking that the ideas were worth kicking around. And it seemed to me that what happened was that a lot of people thought this is a kind of idea that should not be discussed. We already know exactly what there is to say about it, and anybody like you who would associate with people who think these ideas must, be shunned. I mean, that's what it looked like to me, and I was shocked.
And I think there was a little bit more to it than that, because there are scientists are appalled at the anti-scientific kinds of arguments that many creationists certainly do pull, and they're frustrated about it. And the fact is that I shouldn't have tried to have a conversation with Michael Behe within the Blogging Heads format, because the details of the argument he was making are not something you can get across in this format. And so much of the thing had to be spent with me just listening to him spin out his basic idea that I think a lot of people looked at maybe the first half and got the idea that the entire thing was dedicated to me telling him what a genius he was, and that's all that I wanted to do. And I can understand.
Oh, I see. So it ended up giving more credence and sort of more legitimacy, and not a sufficient opportunity for counter.
Yeah, it wasn't a good Blogging Heads format. That was my mistake. But the one thing about it is, it's very simple. I am not a creationist. I love natural science and biology and genetics. I read about all the time. Anybody who reads Michael Behe's book, and the thing is, so few people would be inclined to do it because of this poisonous atmosphere. Anybody who read his latest book from cover to cover would see that you cannot help but come away with a reasonable sense that there is something more than natural selection going on. And I'm very much open to being shown by experts that Behe is completely crazy. I find it all very interesting. But it's interesting. Since then, needless to say, I've gotten an avalanche of mail from people on both sides of that debate, including people sending me what they think of as things that deep six what Behe wrote in that book. And I have gone over all of those things very carefully, and all of them leave the questions standing. So, I don't know. Maybe Behe is completely wrong, but that's what
I didn't want to reopen the whole, the whole sort of substantive debate about creationism and
why should we?
Intelligent design and all of that. And I don't, I'm not going to express an opinion one way or the other. I do think that an assault on science sort of was taking place during the George W. Bush years, and I can see people getting their backs up a little bit about, about all of the charlatans running around and all of that. But I guess the thing that impresses me is what I see as a kind of intolerance, a kind of sort of self-satisfied and smug enlightenment. We are the ones, the right-wing crazies, the ones who don't, know if Barack Obama is a citizen, the ones who think that there is no such thing as global warming, the ones who believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, or the ones who have some questions about the kind of, received wisdom about the, those are know-nothings. They're idiots. They're also Republicans. But we, this new generation of enlightened people, we, who are superior, and the kind of contempt that's expressed for religious beliefs. So then a guy just wants to have a conversation about some of this stuff. That guy being you, and then suddenly, it's as if you I don't know what the right metaphor is, but committed a bad faux pas.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because, I mean, really, I still don't fully understand where the idea comes from among the sort of people you're talking about regarding the creationist debate. That there is no intelligent descent possible whatsoever to the mechanics of evolution. They seem to argue as if it's all just, been figured out. And so as far as they're concerned, someone like me is definitely one of the unenlightened. I must be unwilling to look at certain truths. I must have some kind of bias. It really isn't clear to me that the information is as clear-cut as these people say, based on my reading of this book. But yes, this did happen, and people were not...
But how are you faring? That's what I want to ask, because you went into a long hiatus, and it seemed like you were kind of scarred by the whole experience, if I may ask.
No, that's okay. Not scarred, frankly, rather disgusted, and to be perfectly honest, I'm used to being Mr. Evil when it comes to race. There's this idea that I deliberately write things to be controversial, and, that's always going to be my reputation. And that's fine. I made that bet, and I lie in it, and I know that I'm committed to doing good. But I must admit...
Controversialist. John McWhorter, controversialist.
Right, it's something I do on purpose. But I must admit, people often tell me about my bravery. There are limits to it. I am not interested in being screamed at by yet more people. I'll take it from black people and fans of the race debate, but I'm not going to take it.
Well, I was going to say, you had a whole bunch of people calling you an idiot and a dangerous figure and all of that, but they were black people, and therefore you could take their bars.
And the white ones, too. I mean, I don't mind somebody telling me that I'm a race traitor, wherever they're coming from. That's just the way it's going to happen to be, because I know that I'm not. But then when it comes to other people yelling and screaming at me about something that I'm not, I must admit that I just thought, this isn't fun. Why bother? I have other things that I do. I'm teaching a class at Columbia, etc. And so, not scarred, just disgusted and not wanting to go to that place.
I got to tell you something about the core curriculum at Columbia. My son's a freshman there now.
Nehemiah, that's right.
Nehemiah. And so he's taking, the required courses that you take in the first year with the core.
I taught that last year, that's right.
Taking classical literature course and reading, great books. And he's taking a science course, and his comment on the science course is, and it's apropos of what we're talking about in this indirect way, his comment is, I wish they'd teach us real science. Instead of this pop stuff where they take all the math and all the analytics out of it, so that they can teach it to people who are going to be history and English majors and who don't care anything about science. He says when we read, Homer, we're reading Homer.
Right.
But when it comes to science, then everything gets kind of generalized and watered down and dumbed down.
How do you cram that kind of math down freshmen and sophomores' throats if they just haven't had it?
You can't. But it's a commentary on the scientific illiteracy of a very intelligent set of people, namely people who will go to Columbia College but who didn't, do much math and science in high school. I mean, in other words, the same degree of mastery of mathematics, the degree of mastery of mathematics and basic science that it would take in order to do a serious course is about the same as the degree of mastery of, verbal skills, reading and interpretation and such, that it takes to be able to read one of these serious books.
Exactly.
But whereas you would regard yourself as completely uneducated if you couldn't pick up a serious book written in the 17th century by a guy, somebody who had important ideas, I don't know what, John Milton or somebody, you couldn't pick up. You wouldn't regard yourself as educated if you couldn't pick up such a book and get
something out of it. Right.
But you can regard yourself as educated if you can't sit through a basic, first-year college course appropriately.
Right.
Gauged about serious science.
And obviously this can't change until we have a completely different approach to how education works across the country. And it seems we'd even have to have some sort of national standard. And of course then you get into a whole conversation about that and how much school people should have. But this is definitely the case. I've heard other Columbia students complain that there's a kind of puffy quality to that science requirement, and they wish that it were a little more heavy duty. But math is a very difficult thing to teach after a certain point, especially when there are things that are maybe more pressing in terms of an education after a certain age. Yeah, I mean it's a fundamental.
He says that kids who are at Columbia in the College of Engineering and Applied Sciences don't have to take the science part of the core curriculum. He says it's as if they think their time is too important to waste, but they can waste my time.
I didn't know that.
Anyway, that's that. So what's on our agenda to talk about today?
Well, for one thing, I figure that we should talk about the fact that it was a year ago today now that Barack Obama was elected president, and whether or not it's made the kinds of differences that we were hoping it was going to make. I find myself thinking this week, for example, about the whole race debate and whether it's made a difference in how we talk about race. And I very much think that it has, and I'm reveling in it. What do you think about that?
You would, John. You would think that it had. I mean, you were always predicting that it was going to, so you're finding what you wanted to find.
I certainly am. I'm looking for it all the time.
I don't know. I'd like to hear what you think that the race debate has been significantly affected by Obama's election. I don't quite see it. I don't necessarily disagree, but I want to hear what the case is. For example, that incident this past summer with Henry Louis Gates Jr. was a fiasco, in my opinion.
Sure was.
And certainly didn't do anything to advance or restructure the race debate. It just gave occasion to evidencing how pathological is the public discourse on racial questions in this country. And I don't mean that about left or right. I just mean it about it's stupid, insubstantial, and all about posturing and symbolism. So I don't think the race debate was elevated by Obama's performance this summer. But, I mean, perhaps you had something else in mind.
Well, I think that obviously there's the posturing and the exaggeration. But what interests me is that throughout 2009, every 3 months when something like that comes up, and it's almost like clockwork, you find that the people who are doing the posturing now do not have the call upon public consciousness that they did 5 years ago, 4 years ago. Things have changed. And so a quick example would be the Gates episode, where a certain analysis popped up on op-ed pages the next day, which was that it showed that America is still shot through with good old-fashioned racism, and Sergeant Crowley was a racist, etc. And the case fell apart. He turned out to be teaching sensitivity training. It turned out that it hadn't been reported that the men supposedly breaking into the house were black. The aftermath of all of that was that race maybe played a part in it, but that Professor Gates also played a part in it. Or another quick example, the swimming pool incident this summer, when a swimming pool near Philadelphia, its owners were accused of not letting a black camp group in because of the color of their skin. And for a little while there was a kerfuffle over that. It turned out they'd let other black camp groups in, that they had turned away a white camp group for the same reason that they thought there were too many people. So it fell apart. Okay. And that happens again and again and again. And I think that's a sign of change.
All right. So some of this old, if you'll allow me, Sharpton-esque kind of race card mongering stuff has been trimmed back and can't get the traction that it used to.
Exactly.
Nappy-headed hose wouldn't play quite the same way today as it did when it
For example.
happened.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And I'll grant that. And I don't know. Obama probably maybe has had something to do with that.
He's an elephant sitting in the room.
If not him personally, then the fact of his elevation to the presidency and all that the country's excitement about a black candidate probably has changed the environment in a way. But where's the leadership on race questions? In other words, I thought when you said Obama had changed, I thought you meant he had changed. I mean, that is to say, I thought you meant he had actually done something. That is, he had taken in some sense or another ownership of some aspect or another of the race question and had pointed the country in a different, more constructive, more elevated, more adult and sensible direction. He most decidedly has not done that. And it could be argued, and it's a good thing too, that he's been skillful enough to keep himself above as the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, and so all of those more or less mundane and trivial questions, and not dissipate himself, and that the Gates fiasco was a fiasco precisely because that's the one instance when he didn't dodge the bullet. He should have simply kept himself out of it, et cetera, et cetera. A person could make that kind of argument, but I still don't give Obama credit for changing anything.
Yeah. Well, how would he, though? I mean, the fact of the matter is that, just as you used to say in some of your older literature, what we're really talking about is a particular segment of the black and the Latino community, and I think that the issues differ between people of those two colors, actually, in many ways. But we're talking about a specific group. You used to say it was a third. I would say now that it's about a quarter. And the question is, what policies do we need to address those groups? And this is the funny thing. It seems that in a country where we're in this kind of financial crisis, and when we're fighting two wars, the saddest thing in the world is that if we're trying to come up with a priority for our president right now, perhaps it is not the troubles of one part of one group. And so I would say give him another 3 years. We've got some big stuff.
I won't argue with you about that. I think that's fine. Listen, can we, how do you think he's doing? And you say it's 1 year. I mean, how, I don't want a report card, but I'm just in a sense of how things are going.
I am very much pleased. It seems to me, and I guess I'm just not playing fair here, I don't think that the year benchmark is significant except in a kind of celebratory or journalistic sense. I mean, obviously the man is finding that change is not something that can come as quickly as he was hoping, or maybe pretending to hope. But it seems to me that we are not seeing any complete disasters. We're seeing some stalls here and there, particularly on the international scene. But it's much too early to say that there's been anything like a failure. And he's been trying very hard to do some very difficult things. And economists such as you will differ on whether or not the economy should be in better shape now or could be in better shape. But it seems to me that certainly progress has been made. He does not have egg on his face as far as what he coordinated for the economy. And in terms of health care, something that was being said RIPs over very recently is now moving in a certain direction, and about as good as I would have expected. And so at this point, I find myself looking at Afghanistan as the one possible disaster. His entire presidency could go down, if you ask me, if he ends up sending any enormous number of troops over there to try to hold the country on lockdown. I don't think that's a good idea. But we'll have to see. After a year, it's too early to say what's going to happen. What do you think on his record?
Well, I think you touched on a lot of the different issues. I think he's doing okay, not great, and and I'm not as optimistic going forward. I just don't know. I see a number of minefields. I think the resentment against the banks and Wall Street is very, very deep, and the disillusionment in the base about the fact that the administration has been pretty conservative. I don't mean ideologically, but I just mean cautious and guarded and pretty conventional in its response to the Wall Street aspect of this problem. I'm talking about the financial institutions. I'm not talking about the overall unemployment rate and everything.
Right.
I think the stimulus is, that's the right direction. Krugman says too little. Probably right, maybe too little, but, he's got political constraints. But I think this issue of where the money is, and who are the powers behind the scene, and what's the government acting on behalf of? Is this a movement on behalf of the people, or is this a movement on behalf of the well-heeled and so forth? And the promise of change was that it was going to be something very different than what it had been. And I don't know if Wall Street actually shows that to be the case.
No.
Another thing I was thinking about was this leadership on the world stage stuff. I was, of course, as everybody was, amused maybe and struck by Obama being awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace as he girded for war in Afghanistan. I don't want to rehash all the commentary about was it deserved and what about the the Scandinavians who gave it to him, and is there a one world mentality lurking somewhere in the back of his head and so forth. But I must say that as I read some of the conservative commentary criticizing the speech that he gave at the United Nations and so on, I think of Krauthammer in particular. Yes. I know he's very controversial. Charles Krauthammer is hated on the left. But he's not wrong every time. And I thought some of the things he said about the kind of, naivete of the president's global view that, we can all get along here if we can just see our commonalities and not have to define things in black and white terms. Taking that rhetoric, red state, blue state rhetoric from domestic politics into the global stage, because we have common problems, we necessarily going to be able to cooperate with our... And their argument that maybe that was a little bit naive, and that the president might have maybe even embarrassed himself a bit by the kind of hopeful and not hard-headed and realpolitik tone of his remarks. So I'm thinking about that. Afghanistan, yeah, but that's not going to resolve in a year.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to take a while. It could well end up having ruined his presidency, but it won't kill the 2010 re-election.
Mm-hmm.
But unemployment at 11% in October of 2010 would be a very, very bad thing for the president. So,
It's interesting. It seems to me that Obama takes a lot of heat for that kind of speech that he makes, where he talks about us finding our problems and working on common solutions, and also with the humility that he projects about America and taking America having certain culpabilities for actions in the past. And it seems to me that why can't we accept that as a strategy, as a gesture, as a diplomatic statement, as a beginning, and in terms of carrying the bigger stick and making more belligerent statements or drawing lines in the sand, that could come after he's made that kind of opening. Because it seems to me that the kind of Obama speech that people are waiting for, where he draws lines in the sand and talks about what we're not going to take anymore, that would play well in the movies. But it seems to me that given the kinds of anti-Americanism that we have in the world, whether we like it or not, it's the wiser strategy to dispense with that kind of rhetoric, particularly since there was a model for it during the 8 years before. Not just because it isn't polite, but because it probably won't get as much done. It seems that we have to begin with the fact that America has done things wrong and to acknowledge it. Is that a wrong thing for him to do?
I'm not, look, you don't need to prompt me to be mindful of the fact that America has done things wrong. I agree with that, and is doing things wrong more pertinently.
And should say it on the world stage.
Well, but here's the point. The point is that, acknowledging that we're the only nation to have used nuclear weapons, as we did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where we incinerated tens of thousands of human beings, or that we have a troubled past with respect to issues of basic human rights and how our government has conducted itself vis-a-vis the native population of the continent or vis-a-vis the descendants of the slaves or whatever. To acknowledge all of that is one thing. To actually change the baseline conduct of American power in the world and to make it be on behalf of less specifically American interest and more generally human interest is another altogether. He ain't going to do that latter thing. And can you seduce the world into not noticing that you're pursuing your interests willy-nilly and perhaps riding roughshod over the people who get in your way? A great power is a great power. By definition, when we want something, we're prepared to knock heads in order to get it. Mm-hmm. Whether that head knocking be through economic sanctions, through diplomatic isolation, through military threat, or through actual physical force. So, there's a disconnect in my mind between this hopeful rhetoric that can get the Norwegians all excited about a new world order being led by a new generation of visionary and transnational humanism. On the one hand, and the actual exercise of American power on behalf of baseline fundamental interests, which are necessarily in conflict with the interests of other powers in the world. On the other, those somehow there's an incommensurateness there that I haven't seen resolved.
Yeah, it's a nasty one, and it's also equally nasty that there's some problems right now where it's very difficult to see that there could possibly be any solution that would be worthy of the name. For example, the Pakistan situation, and whether you go in with a small or a big stick there. It's not clear what we could do to, for example, uproot al-Qaeda from Pakistan and Afghanistan. I really don't understand what could be done. If anything could be done, it's something that will take a very, very long time. It's quite different from Iraq. In terms of the Nobel Peace Prize, obviously it was an anti-Bush prize, and obviously it was yet another example of Obama being treated as an idea or a concept rather than as a person. To give him a prize based on what you think about when you watch him and what his intentions are is something that is typical of that phenomenon. It's interesting. I was in Norway in 2006, when Obama was not quite the big deal that he would become the following year, and even less so in Europe. And I remember one Norwegian asking me, so what's been going on with the talented mulatto, as she put it, because she couldn't remember his name. And you have to imagine that said in an accent. But he was an object to her even then, the talented mulatto. And to give him a Nobel Prize now is giving it again to the talented mulatto and what he stands for. And we'll see what actually happens.
Well,
and
I
Obama
think it's
knows
an
it,
action.
too.
I think it's an unfortunate action, actually. It devalues the prize. I'm not now speaking as an American or with any necessary reference to Obama.
Mm-hmm.
I speak now as a citizen of the world and as an economist, that is a social scientist, interested in the general phenomenon of branding. How do you create out of nothing the idea that some assessment, evaluation, or opinion is worth taking into account? You know, a prize, you know, the Pulitzer Prize, the Nobel Prize in Literature, you know, these kind of things, a National Book Award, you know, prizes. They're interesting phenomena because, you know, a group of people get together, a committee or something, more or less august, and they decide to anoint. And then the rest of us actually genuflect on the basis of how they've anointed, you know. We go around saying so-and-so, winner of the XYZ prize. We honor them. You know, we raise the honorarium we pay when they come around to speak. We, you know, et cetera. So we acknowledge the value of the prize having been awarded. Therefore, managing prizes, you know, giving them out in such a way that their value persists over time, that becomes an interesting problem. And I, as a citizen of the world, wish that something as valuable as the ability to honor in such a way as to affect the extent of conflict in human affairs, which you might take a Nobel Peace Prize, that is the ability to give it to Nelson Mandela, the ability to give it to Martin Luther King Jr., you know, and make a real difference having done so. This is a valuable asset in world affairs. And so to have the motive for giving become suspect, to have the act of giving get embedded within some partisan and relatively narrow framework or spectrum of opinion, and the prize then becomes an expression of just that spectrum and not anything else. To me, that's a mistake. I mean, it would be a little bit like, and please forgive me for putting it this way, but it comes naturally to mind. It'd be a little bit like giving it to a black person, an African physicist, because it'd never been given to an African before.
Yeah.
And we're going to give a Nobel Prize to an African physicist, but say the person hadn't yet discovered any really fundamental physical law. But, I mean, was a very brilliant physicist, likely at perhaps some point in the future to discover
It's a perfect example.
That would be bad.
Yes, it would be bad. And it would be more about the giver than the givee. It would be the giver showing that they are a person of heightened moral awareness. And that underlies so very much of what we as human beings do in terms of giving out Nobel Prizes, in terms of how we feel about race issues, in terms of the basic human propensity to gossip, in terms of, you know, commenters on blog sites and things like that. And so, yeah, it's there. And I'm sure that the Norwegian, you know, Nobel Prize Committee feels very good about themselves at this point. And they enjoy being united in their intelligent hatred of George Bush. And now here we move on. And unfortunately, the talented mulatto had to be the target of their quest to feel good about themselves again after already having given the prize to Jimmy Carter for a very similar reason. And so it goes. And here we are in our country dealing with real things. And, you know, I think the most refreshing thing is that, you know, whether he won a prize or not, with Obama, it's such a joy to see a president who is reflective and making an effort to actually comprehend the nation's affairs in detail. And, of course, he's going to make his missteps. But no one could say that this person has been asleep at the switch, or that he's not paying attention, or that he's not, if anything, biting off more than he can chew, and actually managing to digest a little more of it than the Clintons did when they came into office not so long ago with a very similar kind of fervor. So far, it's been a joy to watch. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know, we're intellectuals, so we want our president to be an intellectual, as that, you know, we feel reaffirmed by that. But, wait a minute, I was going to ask you about something.
Oh, you know that other thing. Me making people angry. Another topic has been the piece that I did on African American studies departments. which appeared on the Manhattan Institute's Minding the Campus site not too long ago.
I saw the piece, John. I didn't much care for it myself, to be honest with you.
And what did you not like
Well,
about
my
it?
reasons might not be the sort of the pop negative reaction, which would be, how dare you be against black studies.
Which I wasn't.
My thought was, I wish that you had had a more substantive critique of the intellectual agenda of black studies, and less the point that they just teach a party line. I mean, this latter, as I understood your piece, they need to open up and not just have the same old arguments and
Glenn,
sort of
mess with your mouthpiece a little bit. You're kind of coming in and out.
Okay, sorry. How about now?
Now it's fine.
Okay. What I was saying was that, as I understood your piece, your critique was that they have they're sort of not open to a wide range of views and opinions. That kind of have a party line and they teach it. And that well may be true, but I guess I wish I had seen more of a substantive critique of evaluation and critique of what is the field of African American studies, which began in the late 1960s and we're now 4 decades in. What is it? I mean, and what are its intellectual accomplishments? What questions does it raise that weren't raised before, if any? What methods, answers does it give? How successful has it been? Is it reproducing itself? What's the quality and the level of the scholarship? This kind of thing. I mean, I think there's a critique to be made. I just wish it hadn't only, as I understood you, been advanced in terms of, well, when a guy like me shows up there, they always have to have somebody who gives the other, quote unquote, the other side. Right. But when, I don't know, Bill Wilson or Larry Bobo or somebody show up to give a pat, all in the family kind of talk, they never have to have another side to that. Right. That's what I heard you saying, and that may well be true, and it's, regrettable in the way that you say, but it's, what I want to know is, what PhDs in African American studies have been trained at places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so forth, who have written books that have changed the way we think about American history, culture, literature, music, politics, or whatever. And if the answer to that question is no, then, it's bunk and it's a waste of time. And if I can give 10 good examples, then, your complaint may be correct, but it has much less force.
Well, it seems to me, and the part about there having to be a right-thinking person, so to speak, who, does a critique of my talks. That was just meant as an illustration of a general tendency. And what I believe is that if you asked somebody who was part of an African American Studies department the question that you just asked, what they would say is that the value of the work that's being done is in illuminating to thinking people that racism played a bigger part in America's past than we like to think. The line about how, slaves built the Capitol building, America's economy was founded upon slavery, there was slavery in the North too, and also that racism plays more of a part in American life in the present than is apparent. And there's that mission, which is often tacit, but it's very strongly felt. And their answer to your question would be, to the extent that our scholars are showing this, and showing that from the perspective of art, music, politics, economics, history, and literature, then we're doing our job. And my question in the piece was not whether there should be such thing as a Black Studies department. I understand your question. But if there's going to be, then it should be one that really does address blackness writ large. And what that means is that, for example, there's always the course on something along the lines of black radicalism. And so you get, Amiri Baraka and all these people in the course, which is fine. But why not the black conservative side, too? You'd think from a lot of these department syllabuses that there were no black conservatives. And it's not enough to just have Booker T. Washington and then assign 2 pages of Shelby Steele. There should be a whole course about the whole other side, which you don't see. Or one other thing, Glenn, also...
I'd be careful, John. I mean, I don't actually know the facts about what's on the syllabuses of some representative sampling of courses, but I can tell you that... Let's just take the historical figure George Schuyler.
Okay, perfect example.
You know the guy I'm talking about.
Yes.
Right? Wrote for the Pittsburgh Gazette or Courier,
notorious cranky conservative.
For all these years. He was a kind of, H.L. Mencken of color.
You would have appreciated that,
in the first half of the 20th century. And he was a powerful force. Well, in past 1950, he was a powerful force on the right in criticizing a kind of orthodoxy. And, I know about him, and the only reason I really know about him is because I've heard him talked about by the kinds of people who hang around Black Studies departments. So it's not like serious people, who are students of American culture and African American affairs and experience, don't know, about these conservatives. But I don't doubt that there's a bias there. I just wanted to mention one thing, though. I do think there are some good and interesting programs of inquiry that have come out of African American studies.
Certainly there are.
I give just one example. I don't mean to embarrass this young scholar. There's someone named Khalil Muhammad who teaches at Indiana University in Bloomington. And he's in history and African American studies. I just saw the manuscript of his book that's about to be published by Harvard University Press called The Condemnation of Blackness, which is a history of the social analysis of race and crime statistics from 1890 to 1920. Okay? That's what it is. It's a study during the Progressive Era of the ways in which the presence of large numbers of freedmen, former slaves, now 2 generations past slavery, migrating into the northern cities, and the big debate within American society, from politics to the big, great universities about the Negro problem, how these people could be absorbed, what would be their future, and so forth. What are their capacities? What is their nature, and so on. And then also the advent of, statistical data on criminal offending that would allow you, for example, to measure and accumulate the facts about, did blacks commit more crimes? What about the Italian immigrants, the Russian Jewish immigrants, the Polish immigrants, and how are they assimilating, and how do these groups compare with each other? And, with social Darwinism in the air, the kind of modern sensibility of, a scientific and evidence-based assessment of social problems, and all of that. And so certain ideas, certain frames, certain memes and tropes, certain narratives, certain ways of thinking about problems and analyzing them, certain presumptions, stereotypes, biases get formed and shaped and developed. Now here's a young man. This book has got 100 pages of footnotes. The footnotes read 3 and 4 paragraphs deep. He's read carefully, 30 years of the Atlantic Monthly. He's read hundreds of scholarly books written during this period, and has pulled this. This is a monumental scholarly achievement by this young, he might be 30, 35 years old at the most, African-American scholar at Indiana University.
Beautiful.
He is a young product of African-American studies as a discipline, who is changing who is going to change the way that we think about these things. He's a student of David Levering Lewis, the great historian.
David produces good scholars.
David Levering Lewis at Rutgers, But anyway, I'm just saying, if I got 10 people like that, I think I've got myself a field. Notwithstanding the fact that there may be a bunch of knuckleheads running around in that field.
Yeah, and I mean, boy, Khalil Muhammad is going to be very happy when he hears about this blog, I guess. I definitely...
Well, I'm just telling you like it is, man.
I agree with you, and I do not have any problem with the quality of the departments in themselves. The piece that I wrote is not one more saying that there's something wrong with the scholarship coming out of... There's a whole generation now of grown-up, working scholars who were trained in African-American studies departments, and in themselves, they're fine. But this is the sort of thing that I mean. It's the sort of thing that you notice gradually. I happen to be writing a piece for the New Yorker on Louis Armstrong, and so...
Oh, congratulations, John!
Did I not tell you about that?
No, I don't know about this. That is magnificent.
I've enjoyed it, actually. Yeah.
Oh, is it written?
It is written. I'll send you.
I'd love to see it, John.
And I've been just drowning in this man's stuff for the past couple of months, and it's been a lot of fun. Something. What bothers me, and this is something that bothers me about a lot of figures like him. You have a lot of work on black entertainers and black artists in terms of stereotypes they were forced into, in terms of how what they did reflected on the moral rot of our society, etc. Do you know that in terms of biographical treatments of Louis Armstrong, the significant ones, that they're all written by white people? Now, that's not bad in itself, but there's a part of me that wishes that at least one of those books, including the new one coming out by Terry Teachout, would be written by somebody who was the same color as Armstrong. Another example, the founder of the blues, Blues, W.C. Handy. A rather interesting book about him came out last spring, written by a white person. Why wasn't a black person on that? And instead, it seems to me that often the fine black scholars are moved, both from the outside and from the inside, to study something as thoroughly interesting as this book by Khalil Muhammad. That sort of thing is very important to chart. But then there's also just blackness. And it seems to me that there's this strange attractor of the tragedy of blackness, what people need to know about the tragedy of blackness, past and present. I'd like to see the lens widened more in...
Okay, can I just ask you something? Are you sure the authors of these books, let's say about Armstrong or about Handy, are not themselves influenced by the scholarly tradition of black studies, even if they are white?
It is, well, I should also say, I know that there are plenty of works by black authors on figures like this, but you do find many, many holes of this sort in terms... But I was going to say, to be honest, I don't particularly see that. I mean, all of these authors are very sensitive to racial issues, and so there's no question about that. I assume you can say that they have learned that from the way we have learned to talk about race and things we've learned to be sensitive to over the past 40 years. But no, I wouldn't say that Lawrence Bergreen's most detailed biography of Louis Armstrong is informed by the sorts of things that, say, an Amiri Baraka or a Stanley Crouch or an Albert Murray would say about people like that. They quote those people sometimes, but they're books written, by very diligent and very intelligent white people. But it's like, for example, Ethel Waters. Where in the world is the real book on her? I assume somebody must be writing one, but why did it take so long? And it seems to me that that would be one. I would hope to see that one written by a person who was, one, black, and two, a woman. It's not crucial, but it seems to me that if the biography on Ethel Waters is written by some, white journalist, not a bad thing, but it seems to me that sometimes there are holes in how we're documenting ourselves because of a sense of what real black studies work is supposed to be.
Well, I want to. This is interesting, John. I kind of want to. I want to attack you from the McWhorter angle.
Okay.
Attack is too strong. I want to raise a few questions about the argument you've just made from an angle, a point of vision that I would attribute to you, and that is to say, I don't care. I might falsely attribute to you. I don't care what color the writer is. I just care
whether they do it well.
That the book be written, well, sensitively, with deep scholarship and insight, and that what black studies should be about is promoting the writing of such books and the teaching of such ideas with profundity and insight and care, perhaps most of the students of black studies courses will be Chinese one day. I'm not making a prediction. I'm just saying it would be okay with me if that were the case, as long as they were writing these books with insight and so forth and so on. So, when you say there are holes because, you wish the black authors... I mean, I take the point that, in a way, the programs are not producing as many good scholars as they should be. Otherwise, those good scholars would be taking up issues like this, which lie right at hand, as projects, and they'd be writing these books. And maybe that's somehow a measure of their failure, that, as it were, outsiders to black studies tend to be too often the people who are producing the scholarship. But, to me, we just want the scholarship.
Let me refine, because I know just what you mean, and I could make that quote-unquote John McWhorter argument. What worries me is not the quality of the material. Like, I shouldn't sound the note that we have to write about ourselves. It's tired, and it doesn't really make sense. I shouldn't have even said that. What I really mean is that to the extent that our scholarly class are moved, even tacitly, to feel that writing about the tragedy, now I'm sounding like Zora Neale Hurston, writing about the tragedy, writing about the problems, writing about the lessons that black people have to teach, is somehow the most important thing, more important than anything else, the sexiest thing. I feel that we're broken. in a certain way. It seems to me that there has to be equal room for just plain fascination with a black figure just because they did some stuff, whether or not it stuck a finger in anybody's eye, whether or not their life was tragic. And so Ethel Waters, therefore, becomes just as interesting as Billie Holiday, even though Ethel Waters did not have a major substance abuse problem and was not quite as vocal as Billie Holiday about, disliking racism, although she certainly made her statements. It's about us that I'm thinking. I want the black scholarly class to be interested in the full range of what black is, and not just to say it, but to indicate it in that, for example, we would have not only Robin Kelly's wonderful new biography of Thelonious Monk, but also somebody black who would be moved to examine the career of Louis Armstrong and a great many other people. Another example, the spade work on Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was a very interesting figure. In himself, as a guy, he was actually kind of boring, but his times were very interesting. Now, there were various books written about Scott Joplin before by black people. The person who did the real spade work and discovered a wife he had that no one knew about, again, was white. Now, that's fine. Ed Berlin is a friend of mine. He wrote a great book. But I just wish that, maybe a black person would have been as interested in unearthing and doing the spade work on Scott Joplin as they might be in studying, for example, the head of the founder of the Nation of Islam. And so it's just something that's always kind of stuck in my craw.
I don't know, John. I'm less concerned that they be black authors on these things. I think this is American history that we're really talking about here. I mean, an aspect of American history, an important aspect. But anyway, I want to ask you something else. I want to ask you about Louis Armstrong and whether or not you know this passage at the opening of Ralph Ellison's great novel, Invisible Man, where the Invisible Man is down in this basement apartment somewhere, seething at the world and his invisibility, that is his racial invisibility, and setting up what's going to be this great, sort of hyper-modern narrative that Ellison is going to develop. And he's listening to Louis Armstrong.
And it's interesting because Ellison at one point talks about Armstrong as putting on a mask. The idea being that he was this happy little fella because he was warding off racist views of him and his people, and he talks about how the mask is a form of aggression in its way. And I don't know if it's going to make it through editing, but I write in the piece that I think that that's off. That actually
Oh, you mentioned Ellison's use of Armstrong.
Yeah, that.
Okay, good. I can't wait to see it.
And as far as I'm concerned, Ellison was missing it. Armstrong was actually more comfortable with himself than that. It was Ellison, actually, if you read the latest biography of him, come to think of it, who actually had something of a mask that he was putting on to ward off how he thought white people looked at him and how they often did.
Wait a minute. So it's Ellison, the writer, who's adopting the mask.
Armstrong.
Not Armstrong, or he misuses Armstrong when he characterizes Armstrong in this way.
Ellison actually writes somewhere else, can a people live for 350 years? And he meant African Americans at that time. Whoops, I do not use that term. Black Americans at that time. And he said, can they live simply by reacting? And that was his critique of a certain way of looking at the black experience. And then he talked about how when he was growing up, that the people who he grew up with and his friends were actually just living a life. And life wasn't perfect, but you can't leave out that there's a basic human spirit and dignity. That was Armstrong. He was not living his life reacting. He was too busy being himself. He was fascinating in his way. I've become kind of an Armstrong addict over the past couple of months.
So was he a challenger or a compromiser?
Oh, yeah, in terms of this new paradigm. Mostly he was a compromiser.
I mean, there's that big, broad smile, and all those teeth, and it looks like he's kind of mooning a little bit at the...
Steele would call him a bargainer, definitely.
Yeah, a bargainer. I got the wrong word.
Once he was looking at news footage of what was going on down in Little Rock with Orville Faubus refusing to let the black students in, he actually called him... Are we allowed to curse on Blogging Heads? I guess so. He called Orville Faubus a motherfucker, and they had to sanitize it in print into Plowboy. And he was definitely somebody who knew his racism when he saw it. One time somebody popped into his dressing room and said, "How are things, Louis?" And he said, "White folks still ahead." So he knew. He had a sense.
I used to hear that when I was a kid.
I got the feeling that was a set expression, but he was a a bargainer. He was trying to enjoy his life, and so there was some of that. And he had a lot of experience with whites, more than people might think of somebody who grew up in the depths of black poverty in New Orleans. He had a kind of a Jewish fetish. He was kind of a Semitophile. So, definite bargainer, but
knowing you as I do, I know you're also going to deal with the musical qualities and innovative character of his corpus of works.
Definitely.
So I can't wait to read your piece.
Everybody should listen to more Louis Armstrong. But anyway, we should probably
yeah, let's wrap it up. This has been a good conversation.
Yeah, fun one.
And welcome back to Blogging Heads, John.
Thank you. And
I can't tell you how happy it makes me to know that you're back in the fold.
Well, I'll keep coming back, and it's great to talk to you again.
Same here. Take care.
Too.